Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, February 10th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside on February 10th, 2026 is 69.2 degrees, with a low of 50.0, so expect a mild day with comfortable temperatures for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll examine how a string of shootings in Minneapolis is sparking a major funding crunch for the Department of Homeland Security, and break down the risks to the Colorado River from the West's ongoing warm snow shortages that are drying up vital water supplies. Plus, other key stories on national and global developments. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're watching a standoff in Washington that could shut down Homeland Security in just a few days. Ethan, walk us through what is happening right now.
We are 3 days away from the Department of Homeland Security running out of money, that is, this coming Saturday, February 13th. According to the Associated Press reporting in the Chattanooga Times Free Press and on Orlando's WFTV, almost all of the fight is now about immigration enforcement, especially Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Most of the rest of the federal government was funded in a big package President Donald Trump signed last week. Democrats forced DHS out of that larger deal so they could use this week as leverage to change how ICE and Border Patrol operate.
So DHS was separated on purpose. Why did Democrats want to carve it out like that?
Their thinking, according to the AP accounts, was simple. If DHS stayed in the big spending bill, they would lose their best pressure point. By pulling DHS out and giving it only a few extra days of money at current levels, they created a standalone deadline just for immigration enforcement. That short-term patch runs through Saturday, and instead of leading to quiet policy talks, it has turned into a very public showdown. Democratic leaders now say they will not support a full-year DHS bill unless they get what they call dramatic changes to enforcement rules.
What exactly are they so determined to change inside DHS and ICE?
The AP stories carried by WFTV and the Chattanooga paper describe a wish list that is far more sweeping than normal budget writers. At its core, Democrats are trying to write civil liberties protections directly into law for immigration enforcement. They want judicial warrants before officers enter private homes, tighter rules on arrests and detention, clearer limits on use of force, and more transparency about who these officers are. They are also pushing new guardrails on surveillance, including how DHS monitors protests and uses body camera footage.
Before we dig into each piece of that, what set this off politically? Why now?
Democrats point to 2 deadly shootings in Minneapolis early last month as the turning point. According to AP reporting picked up by the Chattanooga Times Free Press and WFTV, ICE agents shot and killed Renee Good on January 7th, and a Border Patrol officer shot and killed Alex Preddy, an intensive care nurse, on January 24th. Both incidents happened in Minneapolis, and Democrats say they expose systemic problems with excessive force and a lack of accountability. Since then, they have framed this DHS bill as their best chance to force nationwide reforms in response.
How are top Democrats talking about those shootings and this funding bill?
Lawmakers quoted in the AP stories say they are not willing to, quote, write another blank check, end quote, for ICE after the deaths of Pretty and Good. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries has been especially blunt, telling reporters that dramatic changes are needed at DHS before any funding bill moves forward. Senate leader Chuck Schumer is echoing that, and both men say the White House has not come close to meeting their demands. Some rank-and-file Democrats are going even further, telling AP they do not want to approve another penny for DHS without major new limits on how ICE operates.
Let's talk about the legal side of this. What do they want to change around warrants and entering people's homes?
Democrats want Congress to say very clearly that immigration officers cannot enter private homes or other private property without a judicial warrant, not just an internal administrative document. According to AP's rundown on WOKV in Jacksonville, They also want stronger standards for when those warrants can be issued, and better record-keeping whenever they are used. The idea is to close gray areas that, in their view, have allowed aggressive raids based on flimsy or poorly reviewed paperwork. It would move immigration enforcement closer to the rules local police face in criminal cases.
And beyond the front door, what are they asking for on arrests and detention?
They are targeting what they call indiscriminate arrests, the kind of broad operations where officers go after one person and end up detaining many others. Democrats want ICE and Border Patrol to verify that someone is not a United States citizen before they can be held on immigration grounds, after years of reports about citizens wrongfully detained. They are also pressing for stronger legal protections inside detention centers, saying abuse and neglect are still too common. According to AP, they see those safeguards as basic due process, not optional extras.
One of the most emotional issues seems to be masks and officer identification. What would change there?
Democrats want officers to remove masks during most routine enforcement and to wear visible identification, like a name or badge number that people can actually read. They also want more coordination with local police so communities know who is operating in their neighborhoods. According to the AP coverage on WFTV, Democrats argue that heavily masked, anonymous federal teams have become symbols of unaccountable force, especially after high-profile protests in recent years. They believe that anonymity erodes public trust and makes it harder to hold anyone responsible when things go wrong.
And what about use of force and possible profiling? How far do they go on that front?
They are seeking tighter statutory standards for when officers can use force, especially deadly force, across ICE, Border Patrol, and other DHS units. Democrats also want to write a clear ban on racial profiling into immigration law, going beyond what the administration currently lists as internal policy. According to AP's summaries, they argue that internal policies are too easy to ignore or quietly change, while statutory rules would be enforceable in court. In their view, the Minneapolis shootings show that the current system of guidance and after-the-fact reviews has failed.
You mentioned surveillance and protests, too. How would their plan affect that?
One of the more novel pieces would limit how DHS uses body camera footage and other tools to monitor protests and political activity. Democrats want to block the government from using body cam video to track protesters, run facial recognition, or build databases of political opponents. WOKV's national segment, drawing on AP, notes that they also want broader limits on DHS monitoring of lawful demonstrations. It is part of a larger push to keep immigration enforcement from drifting into domestic intelligence work.
Given all that, how has the White House responded? What is President Trump offering in return?
The Trump administration has sent at least one written counterproposal, but it has not been made public. Schumer and Jeffries reviewed the latest version over the weekend and, according to AP, dismissed it in a joint statement Monday as, quote, incomplete and insufficient, end quote. They complain it lacks actual legislative text and instead offers vague assurances. From their perspective, that is exactly what they are trying to avoid. They want precise language written into the DHS funding bill itself, not promises they think could be watered down later.
Do we know which of the Democratic ideas the White House might accept and which are off the table?
Not in detail. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has said, as AP relays, that the administration is open to discussing some of the proposals but considers others, quote, non-starters, end quote, and not grounded in common sense. The White House has not publicly spelled out which items fall into which bucket, but Leavitt's tone suggests strong resistance to anything they believe would undermine border security or put officers at risk. That lack of clarity is feeding Democratic skepticism and making it harder to nail down a compromise.
How are Republicans in Congress lining up behind the White House on this?
Senate Majority Leader John Thune is the main GOP voice in the AP stories, and he strikes a cautiously optimistic tone, saying it is good that the sides are, quote, trading papers, end quote. But he has given no sign he will accept the sweeping limits Democrats want on ICE and Border Patrol. Over in the House, Speaker Mike Johnson has zeroed in on the mask and identification issue, arguing that unmasking officers would endanger them and their families by making it easier for activist or criminal groups to dox them. And Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee accuses Democrats, in AP's words, of trying to motivate a radical left base rather than write serious security policy.
Some Republicans are also trying to attach their own priorities to this bill. What are those?
According to the AP coverage, conservatives are not just playing defense. They are also pushing two big add-ons. One would require documented proof of United States citizenship to register to vote in federal elections, a longtime Republican goal that Democrats view as unnecessary and potentially suppressive. The other would crack down on so-called sanctuary cities by penalizing local governments that, in GOP eyes, do not cooperate enough with ICE. For Democrats, those are poison pills, which makes the path to any bipartisan deal even narrower.
With the deadline coming up this Saturday, what options are negotiators actually talking about?
There are basically three live options, plus the cliff. One is the big goal, a full-year DHS funding bill that includes some negotiated reforms. But as of today, according to AP, there is no agreed legislative text and no sign either side is ready to swallow the other's core demands. The second option, which Senator Thune openly favors, is another short-term patch that keeps DHS running while talks continue. The third would split out funding for things like FEMA and TSA, leaving ICE and maybe Border Patrol to be fought over separately.
How realistic is that idea of splitting the bill, funding the less controversial parts first?
There is some quiet interest in that approach on both sides, especially from lawmakers worried about air travel and disaster response. The AP reports talk about the possibility of passing money for FEMA, TSA, and other relatively uncontroversial pieces of DHS, while putting immigration enforcement on a separate track. But Thune is described as cool to that, and Republican leaders fear it could turn ICE into a giant political punching bag. Without his support, the split bill idea faces a very tough road in the Senate.
If none of that happens in time, what would a partial DHS shutdown look like for ordinary people?
Most visible effects would likely show up at airports and along the border. TSA officers and many border agents would still have to work, but they would not get paychecks until Congress acts. And past shutdowns have seen big spikes in sick calls and longer security lines. According to AP reporting referenced on WOKV, Coast Guard pay and FEMA operations can also be hit hard. Thune has warned publicly that we could see travel problems reminiscent of the 43-day government shutdown last year when unpaid TSA staff shortages snarled major airports.
You mentioned masks tying into a separate legal fight out west. How does that relate to this standoff?
WOKV notes that a judge recently blocked California's attempt to ban federal agents from wearing masks while still requiring that their badges be visible. That case is separate from the DHS funding bill, but it shows how questions about federal officers' anonymity are bubbling up nationwide. Democrats in Congress want to write a national rule through this bill, while Republicans like Speaker Johnson argue that unmasking is a serious safety risk. The California ruling, which allows masks but insists on visible identification, effectively sketches out a middle ground, though there is no sign negotiators here have rallied around that specific model.
Politically, who believes they have the upper hand if this goes to a shutdown?
Both sides seem convinced the other will be blamed. Democrats, especially after the Minneapolis shootings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good, feel real pressure from civil rights advocates and their base to deliver hard, statutory changes, not just oversight hearings. They argue, as AP recounts, that passing a clean DHS bill now would mean wasting a rare moment when public attention is squarely on ICE and Border Patrol conduct. Republicans, for their part, say Democrats are holding national security hostage to a radical wish list and trying to, quote, handcuff, end quote, law enforcement.
So as of this morning, Tuesday, February 10th, what is the bottom line?
The Associated Press, across the Chattanooga Times Free Press, WFTV in Orlando, and WOKV in Jacksonville, paints a picture of talks that are active but stuck. There is still no agreed text on the core reforms. Democrats have branded the White House offer incomplete and insufficient, and procedural escape hatches like another short-term patch do not yet have broad buy-in, the risk of a partial DHS shutdown by Saturday is real and growing. And underneath the budget mechanics, this has become a proxy fight over how much power ICE and other federal officers should have when they show up at someone's door.
It is a high-stakes fight with very little time left on the clock. Ethan, thanks for breaking it all down for us.
Thanks, Grace.
Across much of the West, this winter just hasn't looked or felt like winter, and scientists are calling it a historic warm snow drought. Reporter Chloe Nguyen has been following what that means for water, wildfire, and the Colorado River. Chloe, how far from normal is this season?
It is about as off the charts as it gets in the modern record. According to the National Snow and Ice Data Center, a typical early to mid-winter would see roughly 460,000 square miles of the West under snow. This year we have only about one-third of that. A NASA-based analysis summarized on drought.gov found that on February 1st, just over 139,000 square miles were snow-covered, the lowest for that date in a 25-year satellite record. The center's director, Mark Serres, told the Associated Press he has lived in Colorado for nearly 4 decades and said, quote, "I have not seen a winter like this before. This pattern that we are in is so darned persistent," end quote.
And it is not just less snow, it is that it is unusually warm too, right?
Exactly. NOAA and drought.gov describe this as a classic warm snow drought, where precipitation might not be terrible on paper, but it falls as rain instead of snow because temperatures are so high. Since December 1st, more than 8,500 daily high-temperature records have been broken or tied across the West, and at least 67 stations have logged their warmest December through early February on record, according to NOAA reporting cited by NPR and the Associated Press. Colorado State climatologist Russ Schumacher told AP it was so warm in December that only the very highest peaks got real snow, while storms at mid and lower elevations that normally build the snowpack just produced rain, and researcher Daniel McAvoy added that an unusually warm, dry January then compounded the deficit.
What kind of big-picture weather pattern gave us a warm West while the East has been buried in snow?
Meteorologists talk about a seesaw pattern called a dipole. This winter, a stubborn, high-pressure ridge parked over the western states, which, as WeatherWest and Drought.gov explain, has deflected Pacific storms north and created clear skies and abnormal warmth. Downstream, that ridge is paired with a deep trough over the central and eastern United States, which has delivered more than 2 weeks of bitter cold and heavy snow east of the Rockies, as the Associated Press has reported. That pattern has been reinforced by a shift from La Niña toward more neutral Pacific conditions, which often favors dryness for parts of the interior and southern West.
When you step away from the maps and look at daily life, what are people actually seeing on the ground?
The images almost look like the wrong season. In a Salt Lake City suburb called West Jordan, one Utah resident told AP he was walking to the store in gym shorts and a t-shirt in early February, with bare ground where he would normally be snowboarding. At Salt Lake City's airport, the National Weather Service told AP it has been more than 320 days since a storm dropped at least an inch of snow in a day, the longest stretch since the 1890s. One AP photo shared by Seattle's KIRO7 shows a golfer hitting off bright green grass in Sheridan, Colorado, with nearly snowless Front Range mountains behind him, something you would not expect even in March.
The Colorado River keeps coming up in these stories. Why does this snow shortage matter so much for that river in particular?
Western water managers like to say that the real reservoir is not just the dams, it is the mountain snowpack. In a normal year, storms bury the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, and the Cascades in snow that melts gradually from April into July, feeding creeks, rivers, aquifers, and reservoirs. For the Colorado River, that high country snow generates roughly 2/3 of the flow that supports about 40 million people and some of the country's most productive irrigated farmland, according to KUNC Public Radio and Bureau of Reclamation data. When that snow bank fails, Everything downstream feels it.
So what are the numbers this year in those key headwaters that feed the Colorado?
They are grim. Drought.gov and the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center say that snowwater equivalent in many watersheds above Lake Powell is running barely around one-half of the historical median, roughly between 47 and 61% in early February, with Utah statewide closer to one-third of normal. Several critical basins, like the Deschutes, the Yakima, the Rio Grande, and parts of the upper Colorado, are below half of median, with some southwest subbasins near zero accumulation. Based on that, federal forecasters project that unregulated April through July inflow into Lake Powell will be only about 38% of average this year, roughly 2.4 million acre-feet of water.
That brings us right to the big reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Where do they stand as we talk today?
They are low enough that federal engineers are running worst-case scenarios. Lake Powell, behind Glen Canyon Dam, is only about 26 to 27% full, sitting near elevation 3,535 feet above sea level, according to recent Bureau of Reclamation updates. The minimum level to keep Glen Canyon's hydropower turbines spinning is about 3,490 feet, and under the Bureau's minimum probable forecast, Powell could drop to roughly 3,490.6 feet by late 2026, just inches above that cutoff. Downstream, Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam is at roughly one-third of capacity, around elevation 1,070 feet, and already in a Tier 1 shortage. Reclamation projections summarized by American Rivers and regional outlets show Mead possibly sliding toward about 1,049 feet by late next year, which would be on the edge of a Tier 2 shortage and deeper mandatory cuts for Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico.
If Glen Canyon Dam actually dipped below that power level, what would losing hydropower there mean?
It would be a big deal for the Western grid. Glen Canyon's turbines provide a flexible, carbon-free source of electricity that utilities rely on to balance solar and wind. And water policy analysts told Inside Climate News that replacing that power would likely mean more expensive and dirtier options in the short term. Engineers are already looking at ways to move water through lower bypass tubes if Powell falls below power pool, so they can still release water for legal obligations even if the dam is no longer making electricity. But reclamation officials and hydrologists warn that if we get anywhere near that line, it is a sign the whole system is under extreme stress.
We have talked about the big picture. How quickly will farmers and rural communities feel this on the ground?
Agriculture takes the first hit because it uses roughly 3/4 to 4/5 of Colorado River water in a typical year. Forecasts pulled together on drought.gov and reported by stations from Nevada to New Mexico suggest many streams will run at 50% of normal or less this spring, so irrigation districts in places like the Humboldt Basin, parts of the North Platte, and the Rio Grande are already warning growers to expect cutbacks. That means more fallowed fields, fewer water-intensive crops, and, where possible, a heavier draw on groundwater. Ranchers in Colorado and New Mexico are dealing with poor forage and dry range, and some are culling herds or paying higher hay prices just to get through the season.
Are cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles already changing how they use water because of this?
Many of them started years ago, but this winter is reinforcing that urgency. Cities that depend on the Colorado River are planning for possible deeper cuts tied to higher shortage tiers, and agencies in Southern California are racing to diversify away from imported snowmelt. According to Water Education Colorado and regional water districts, that means more tiered pricing, strict outdoor watering rules, turf removal rebates, and heavy investment in reuse and groundwater recharge. The basic message from local utilities is that snowpack alone can no longer be the backbone of their supply.
You mentioned earlier that California has been something of an exception. How is the Golden State faring this winter?
California got lucky in December, when a series of powerful atmospheric river storms, sometimes called Pineapple Express systems, dumped heavy rain and mountain snow, especially in the Sierra Nevada. That boosted reservoir levels and left California's snowpack in better shape than much of the Rockies and Cascades, which Associated Press stories carried by ABC News have emphasized. But even there, temperatures have run warmer than average, and climate scientists point out that California is seeing the same long-term trend toward more rain and less snow. So it is relatively better off this year, but not insulated from the bigger pattern.
For ski towns and winter tourism, what has this season looked like?
Pretty bleak outside the higher Sierra. Many ski areas in the Cascades and Central Rockies have delayed opening, closed to rain, or leaned heavily on artificial snow, which itself is harder to make when nights stay warm, according to reporting from local stations cited by AP. Lower elevation hills in places like Oregon and Utah have spent much of what should be peak season staring at brown slopes, and that hurts small businesses that depend on winter visitors. One Utahn interviewed by AP summed it up by saying his snowboarding winter basically never arrived.
Some people may wonder if this is just one really bad winter. What are scientists saying about the role of climate change?
Researchers are very clear that human-driven warming is a central reason this drought is so warm and so damaging. The sheer number of high-temperature records and the persistence of the ridge over the west look exactly like what climate models have been projecting, and Colorado's Russ Schumacher told the Associated Press that while it is tough to pin down every storm track on climate change, the extreme warmth itself is much easier to attribute. Climate scientist Daniel Swain and others have warned for years, through outlets like Inside Climate News and Weather West, that hotter conditions would drive more events like this, where storms that used to bring snow now bring rain, the snow line marches uphill, and the air's thirst pulls more water out of soils and plants. They described this not as a passing drought, but as part of a broader aridification of the American West.
Put this in historical context for us. How does 2026 compare with notorious drought years like the Dust Bowl era or the 1970s?
When researchers dig into older manual snow records and tree ring reconstructions, they find some striking parallels. Utah, for example, had about half its normal precipitation in 1934, and parts of the upper Colorado Basin saw snowpack as poor as, or even worse than, what we are seeing now. And the 1950s and 1977 also brought brutal low snow years in parts of Colorado and California. But there are two big differences today. Temperatures are higher, which means the same meager snow yields less runoff, and the West has far more people and infrastructure depending on that water. Lake Powell did not exist in the 1930s or 50s, but modeling studies summarized by Colorado State researchers suggest that if it had, it might have flirted with Deadpool back then. Now we face similar hydrology layered onto a much bigger and hotter system.
You have also been reporting on deeper structural problems with how the Colorado River is managed. What are the biggest ones?
The first is simple overpromising. The 1922 Colorado River Compact assumed the river carried about 16.5 million acre-feet a year, but modern reconstructions show the true long-term average closer to 12.5. So the law of the river created roughly 4 million acre-feet of paper water that does not actually exist, as policy analysts like Eric Kuhn have explained to KUNC. On top of that, the lower basin states routinely use between a little over 1 million and 1.5 million acre-feet more than what flows into Lake Mead once evaporation and system losses are counted. A chronic structural deficit that has been draining reservoirs for 2 decades. All of that sits on a foundation where roughly 3/4 of the water goes to irrigated agriculture, much of it for thirsty forage crops, and a warming climate is steadily reducing how much runoff each inch of precipitation produces.
So would it be fair to say this winter is more of a trigger than the root cause of the emergency?
That is exactly how many experts frame it. A recent Bureau of Reclamation analysis, echoed by river scholars Jack Schmidt and Eric Kuhn in interviews with Inside Climate News and American Rivers, suggests this winter's warm snow drought explains maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of the sharp drop in expected inflows for 2026. The rest is the product of century-scale overallocation, long-running overuse in the lower basin, and climate-driven aridification that has been eroding the system's buffer for years. One policy report summarized by KUNC put it starkly, saying this winter did not break the Colorado so much as, quote, called the bluff, end quote, of a river that has been overspent for decades.
All of this is coming to a head just as the current river rules are about to expire. Where do negotiations stand, with that February 14th deadline only a few days away?
The timing could not be more tense. The interim guidelines and drought contingency plans that govern Lakes Powell and Meade expire at the end of 2026, and on January 9th of this year, the Bureau of Reclamation released a draft environmental impact statement laying out options for new rules. As of today, the 7 basin states are still split. The lower basin proposal from Arizona, California, and Nevada favors a total system contents approach that ties cuts to combined storage in the big reservoirs, while the upper basin states want a more explicitly supply-driven scheme that links their obligations to actual hydrology, in part to shield them from what they see as lower basin overuse. Reporters at KUNC and Inside Climate News say negotiators are now talking about a 5-year bridge deal to get past 2026 and avoid lawsuits while they wrestle with those deeper structural fights.
Beyond the negotiations, where are we already seeing concrete adaptation efforts on the ground?
There is a lot happening, especially on conservation. In the Upper Basin, the System Conservation Pilot Program has been re-upped through 2026, and Colorado is offering as much as about $509 per acre-foot of water that farmers agree to leave in the river, with Utah testing a new accounting system this year to make sure conserved water actually reaches Lake Powell. Cities are tightening outdoor watering rules, raising prices for high use, and doubling down on turf removal and efficiency programs that have already driven down per-person use over the past 2 decades. It is a mix of short-term emergency savings and longer-term cultural shifts.
And on the supply side, what are some of the biggest new projects meant to make cities less dependent on snow?
One of the marquee efforts is called Pure Water Southern California, a roughly $8 billion advanced wastewater recycling plant backed by the Metropolitan Water District. According to engineering and regional news outlets, the board is expected to certify the final environmental review today, February 10th, and the project aims to produce on the order of 150 million gallons of purified water per day by around 2032, cutting Los Angeles area reliance on imported Colorado and State Water Project water. Smaller but similar projects like the Pure Water Los Verdines Triunfo plant in western Los Angeles County are moving toward construction this spring, and Arizona is expanding managed aquifer recharge with the Gila River Indian Community's MAR5 project, often cited as a model for banking water underground in wetter years. There is also renewed talk of desalination along the Baja California coast to free up some Colorado River water, even as controversial plants like the one proposed at Huntington Beach remain shelved.
Farmers are at the center of this story too. Are you seeing changes in what they plant or how they irrigate?
Yes, and some of it is quite dramatic. Agricultural press and policy outlets report that, between water scarcity and economics, Central Valley growers and some Colorado River districts are pulling out tens of thousands of acres of high-value but water-hungry crops, including an estimated 40,000 acres of vineyards expected to come out this year alone. In parts of the Southwest, some farmers are shifting from corn and other thirsty staples to more drought-tolerant or higher-value crops that justify the cost of conservation technology. Federal money from the Inflation Reduction Act is helping them install precision drip and micro-sprinkler systems, many modeled on Israeli designs, to squeeze more production out of every unit of water they still have.
With the snowpack so thin and melting early, what are fire managers bracing for later this year?
The National Interagency Fire Center is already warning about an early and potentially intense fire season in the Southwest, the Great Basin, and parts of the Pacific Northwest. When snowpack is shallow and disappears weeks early, soils and vegetation dry out much sooner, essentially lengthening fire season, and Daniel McAvoy at the Western Regional Climate Center told the Associated Press that this winter's warmth is rapidly drying both soil and fuel. The snowline has retreated unusually high, so mid-elevation forests and shrublands that would normally stay buried into late spring are bare and exposed to warm, dry air. Put together with existing drought and many fuels, that is a recipe for more and earlier large fires.
Looking ahead a few weeks, is there any realistic chance that late storms could still rescue this snow season?
Hydrologists say we may get some help, but not a rescue. Forecasts do hint at a cooler, wetter pattern bringing some snow to parts of the West later in February, and Russ Schumacher told the Associated Press that could chip away at the deficit. But the traditional April 1st peak for snowpack is only weeks off, and when you start this far behind, there is simply no way to rebuild to normal by then. Even a very wet March would leave much of the region well below average and would not change the basic outlook for Lake Powell, Lake Mead, or wildfire risk.
As we move into spring and summer, how will scientists and managers be tracking what happens next?
They will be watching the mountains, the rivers, and the reservoirs in near real time. The SNOTEL network and old-fashioned snow courses will keep updating snow water measurements. Satellites like NASA's MODIS keep an eye on where snow actually covers the ground, and the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center regularly turns that data into new inflow forecasts for Powell, Mead, and hundreds of smaller reservoirs. At the same time, the Fire Center is tracking how fast fuels dry out, and water managers are planning for continued Tier 1 or possible Tier 2 shortages on the Colorado, while modeling what happens if Glen Canyon approaches minimum power pool. And hanging over all of that is that February 14th deadline for the 7 states to agree on a post-2026 framework, which outlets like KUNC and Coyote Gulch say has gone from an abstract policy date to an immediate crisis point because of this winter's snow failure.
Before we let you go, anything our listeners should know about how this story is being covered?
Much of the national, human-focused reporting on this warm snow drought comes from Associated Press journalists Durrani Pineda and Seth Borenstein, whose stories are being carried by ABC News, KRO 7, WFTV, and many others. AP discloses that its water and environmental coverage gets funding support from the Walton Family Foundation, but editors say the foundation does not control content. The more technical and policy-heavy details are coming from federal sources like drought.gov, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, then being translated by regional outlets such as KUNC, Inside Climate News, American Rivers, and specialized blogs like Coyote Gulch. Across all of them, the message is strikingly consistent. This 2025 to 2026 warm snow drought is not just another bad snow year, it is a live stress test of a 20th century water system facing 21st century climate realities.
A sobering picture, and one we will keep following as that Colorado River deadline approaches and the snow season winds down. Chloe Nguyen, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, February 9, 2026, Ghislaine Maxwell turned a deposition into a high-stakes game of let's make a deal. Her attorney, David Oscar Marcus, told the House Oversight Committee that Maxwell is prepared to speak fully and honestly about Jeffrey Epstein's network if President Donald Trump grants her clemency, dangling what she calls unfiltered truth in exchange for a commuted 20-year sentence. Appearing by video from her Texas prison, Maxwell repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to name co-conspirators while her habeas petition is pending. Her team even offered testimony they say would clear both Donald Trump and former President Bill Clinton, a move Democrat Melanie Stansbury labeled a brazen pardon pitch. The gambit puts the White House squarely in the witness box of public opinion, just weeks before scheduled depositions for Bill and Hillary Clinton, and could shape both future House subpoenas and the release timeline for unredacted Epstein files. In the South Caucasus, diplomacy is on a trip, and the stakes are nuclear. Vice President J.D. Vance arrived in Yerevan on February 9th for a historic 2-day visit. the first ever by a sitting United States president or vice president to Armenia. Vance and Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan inked a so-called 1-2-3 agreement on civil nuclear cooperation that could generate up to $9 billion in American exports and long-term contracts for small modular reactors. Vance also unveiled an $11 million sale of VBAT surveillance drones and promoted the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, a proposed 43-kilometer transit corridor through southern Armenia, linking Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave. Washington is aiming to reroute both gas and geopolitics, steering Armenia away from Russian and Iranian dependence while positioning the United States as the chief mediator in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process. Vance heads next to Azerbaijan February 11th and 12th to hammer out final treaty terms that could turn the region into a new trade on-ramp between Asia and Europe. In Michigan, a signature scandal has left two businessmen with their names on the wrong kind of line. A Macomb County jury convicted Sean Wilmoth and Willie Reed on February 9th of running a criminal enterprise and forgery tied to a massive petition fraud that rocked the 2022 gubernatorial primary. Prosecutors said they funneled tens of thousands of bogus signatures to 8 campaigns, knocking Republican frontrunners James Craig and Perry Johnson off the ballot and siphoning more than $700,000 from campaigns. A third defendant, Jamie Wilmoth Gooden, was acquitted. Attorney General Dana Nessel said the fraud denied millions of Michiganders a choice and exposed just how easily petition drives can be penciled into crime. The nearly 4-year case reshaped the Republican field, and now, as Perry Johnson runs again in 2026, Wilmoth and Reed face up to 20 years in prison at sentencing on March 18th. On New York City's hospital front lines, the code word is contract. The largest nursing strike in city history reached a turning point February 10th, as about 10,500 nurses at Montefiore and Mount Sinai reached tentative 3-year deals after a walkout that began January 12th and stretched 29 days. The proposed agreements include a 12% salary bump, enforceable staffing ratios, and a first-of-its-kind clause guarding against artificial intelligence being used to replace nurses, putting a digital do not resuscitate on job cuts by algorithm. Roughly 4,200 New York Presbyterian nurses remain on the picket line, still battling over safe staffing. Union members are voting on ratification through February 11th. If they approve, nurses are expected back at the bedside by February 14th. Turning picket signs into Valentine shifts. And in Los Angeles, a courtroom is putting the scroll in cross-examination. Opening statements have begun in a landmark bellwether trial, accusing Meta and YouTube of designing their platforms to hook children. Lead plaintiff Kaylee G.M., now 20, says so-called addiction by design tools like infinite scroll and algorithmic loops dragged her into depression and suicidal thoughts. TikTok and Snap quietly settled out before the curtain rose, but Meta and YouTube insist their safety efforts are serious and argue that social media addiction is not settled science. At issue is whether recommendation engines can be treated as defective products, potentially piercing the legal armor of Section 230 and setting precedent for more than 1,000 similar cases. Internal evidence, including a project dubbed Project Mist, and testimony from executives, like Mark Zuckerberg and Adam Mosseri, could decide whether Big Tech's like button gets a legal thumbs down when a verdict arrives later in March 2026. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.